So I've been holding onto this Canon HV40 for a little while, partly because of nostalgia, and another part because it's one of my favorite cameras I've ever owned. But this utilizes outdated mini DV tapes, and to actually capture this footage, you need the cables first of all, and second to watch everything play back in real time before it gets converted into a digital file. But then I had this crazy idea, and you know what? It might just work to make this camera viable to use in 2018. So let's take a trip back in time. I'm Matt, and this is Q Time. The Canon HV40 was Mini DV's last hurrah in an era where digital was quickly taking over. Its predecessor, the HV30, was an indie filmmaker favorite, and the HV40 added features such as its native 24-25p cine mode and a custom programmable button. Yeah, big upgrade. Mainly the camera was loved for its excellent video quality, which at the time exceeded AVC HD standards and was easy to edit on most computers. This was until digital technology caught up, and once DSLR video became a thing, these camcorders basically became a museum piece. But there are a few things I miss about these cameras, not just the HV40, and that indie filmmakers effectively lost once interchangeable cameras became the norm. The first is the motorized zoom functionality. Now, there's a big difference between a nice, smooth motorized zoom and having to physically try to replicate this in a photography lens, especially without the help of a follow focus and parfocal or autofocus lens. And at this point, motorized cinema zoom lenses are unviable for most indie filmmakers. This Canon HV40 has a 10 times optical zoom on an f1.8 to f2.8 aperture range with autofocus, so it's nothing to laugh at. Of course, the sensor is smaller than most DSLRs, so low light performance is good, but not great, especially compared to something like a Sony a7S, obviously. But it can still be used to get some pretty creative shots, especially in a comedy, documentary, or even a narrative story where a camera zoom might make sense. The second is the DV aesthetic, which can be used creatively for movies to be set in the past. Of course, these days with plugins from companies such as Red Giant, you can make modern day footage look old, crop it down to 4:3, and you're done. But there's something about the aesthetic of footage that was actually shot on older cameras that's hard to replicate, especially if then wanting to zoom as well, which can be a common element of older home videos. Alright, so that's enough talking. Let's head over to the desk and I'll show you the idea. Alright, so here it is. Here's the rig. It's the Canon HV40 and on top of it is the Atomos Ninja Assassin. And together, basically, I'm taking the HDMI signal out of the Canon HV40, putting it into the Atomos monitor and recording ProRes directly from this camera. So again, there's a few things you kind of need for this to work. You need, first of all, a camcorder which actually has HD output. In this case, I'm pretty lucky the Canon HV40 has a full-size HDMI port. Very unusual these days, so it's kind of nice to have it on the HV40. And then from there, it outputs a clean signal, which can actually change in the settings. So again, if your camera doesn't output a clean option, a clean HDMI signal, you're gonna get a whole bunch of things on the screen, like the recording symbol, the sort of time left remaining in the recording, and a few other settings, which in some cases might actually be a cool thing if you're trying to integrate the camera into the scene, and it kind of saves you a bit of After Effects work in post if it's already there and it's more authentic as well. So that's not a bad idea too. But overall, I've been really happy with the quality coming off this Canon HV40, and just seeing it again on the ProRes recorder has been really awesome. And it's just given this camera a bit more fresh life, I guess, in a sense. And I've got a few more creative applications for it now that I can be bothered to actually record it onto this monitor and then use it straight away in post-production. Whereas if I was going through Mini DV, I would have to buy a whole bunch of adapters these days because none of my computers actually have a FireWire input. And then from there, it just probably wouldn't be worth the cost. As soon as it gets in the $100 range to buy adapters, it's kind of like, yeah, I don't really need it this badly. But in this case, I had the monitor because I used the A7S and it kind of needs a monitor to get a 4K signal out of it. And you might already have one of these monitors laying around. They're really common these days. A whole bunch of people obviously using them for their own digital cinematography work. So I would definitely recommend if you have one lying around and you have an old camcorder, see if you can put the two together. I definitely understand if you don't have one, I don't suggest going out and buying one just for this purpose. So to talk a little bit about the rig, this is far from perfect. Obviously, I've got the Canon HV40 and the Atomos recorder mounted on a ball head, and this is a cheap L bracket, which I've had for some time now. I don't remember when I got this or why I got this for, but effectively it has another cold shoe mount, which is quite nice. It's even a bit creaky these days. And it's definitely not strong enough to hold this whole setup. I can feel like the stress on the brackets just by holding it with one hand. I don't recommend it, but it is kind of nice to then be able to have control over the zoom function here. It just feels a bit better to hold the camera like this, because as you can see, the Adamus kind of dwarfs the Canon HV40 overall. I would probably suggest, as an improvement, to use a magic arm to kind of mount the monitor, offset it a bit, so you can actually put a microphone down here. And you kind of need it for the Canon HV40. It can be pretty noisy even when it's not operating with the tape deck. You can just hear it, which you might even be able to hear it right now. So even better, you might want to get a base plate, get some rails, and find a way to mount it onto that rather than having this whole complicated setup, which kind of just looks really awkward. But again, if you have a particular shot that you're looking to get, it doesn't really matter the way it looks, just get the shot. And in this case, the HV40 actually has a really, really nice signal coming out of it. And a nice image overall. As I said, it's an f1.8 to f2.8 lens. So definitely even works fairly decently in low light, although I would probably just kidding myself when I say that noise looks filmic. It definitely looks like fixed pattern noise. Otherwise, this is what it looks like here. I can sort of just pull out the monitor, pull out the viewfinder here. It kind of hits the side of the arm here, of the grip, I should say. That's fine. I don't really need to see that. I've got the actual monitor here to show me. And I would probably definitely suggest having a shorter HDMI cable. I don't know why I've got such a long HDMI cable at the moment, but if you have a nice short HDMI cable, that'll be a much, much, much better setup. So anyway, let's jump back to the studio. Of course, if you don't already own some kind of monitor that you can also record video, you can still record the built-in media and then transcode the footage later on to something easy to edit using programs such as Compressor or Adobe Media Encoder. But the main point of this video is to illustrate that if you still have a camcorder lying around, you could still use it in your current films, but thoughtfully and creatively. I know I was excited to pick up my old camera again, and I want to find a way to utilize it, especially now that you can record ProRes with the Adamus monitor. There are a lot of downsides to this rig at the moment, including the fact that it's just totally unbalanced, and the Canon HV40's tape deck emits this high-pitched whine, which makes recording audio difficult. I would also suggest using a lightweight HDMI cable and Blu-Tack if you're using the HV40 not to damage the port, which appears to be somewhat loose on my model. But this isn't a DSLR replacement. It's just another creative tool you can have in your gear bag, especially if you already have one of these relics lying around. I'm keen to know if any of you guys have an older camcorder that has some of these features, like the HV40, because I feel as though HDMI ports and clean HDMI video out was not very common for the day. But hopefully this video gives you some ideas anyway. Of course, they still manufacture camcorders of this design, which shoot up to 4K of course, but to me that defeats the purpose of the older DV aesthetic, so I'm going to keep my HV40 for now. One camera I don't need to worry about the next version of. So just before I go, I actually wanted to interrupt myself here, and I'm actually shooting this months apart from when I originally recorded the segment before, and just give a few little thoughts before I wrap up. The Canon HV40 is a really cool little tool, and I've actually had the opportunity to use it for a job as well when I needed a camcorder that could zoom in, and this was shooting more sports. So of course, if you were going to be shooting that all the time, you'd probably rent a much bigger camera and you'd want a more professional setup. But in our case, it was more not imperative that it needs to be the best kind of camera around. So the HV40 really kind of suited that. Using the Adamus recorder, a couple of things I noticed from real world usage and actually trying to edit this footage later. There's not a huge amount of dynamic range, and this is probably pretty obvious, but highlights tend to get clipped pretty easily. So, and you don't have a lot of control over the actual image in camera as well. If you have a more professional version of these camcorders, it definitely gives you the option to control aperture and ISO. But in this case with the HV40, you're choosing one of them. You're either choosing shutter speed or you're choosing to affect the aperture, and the camera decides on the rest. So you don't have a lot of control there. Manual focusing isn't a thing. You've got autofocus, which is good, but it tends to sometimes be really quick to autofocus, which doesn't give you very cinematic results. There's a little slider on the side of the camera, a little dial I should say, which you can use to manually focus. But given the fact the dial is so small, you can't continuously rotate it around. So you kind of get this little stagnated movements as you're focusing in manually. And these are just a few of the things that I've noticed from actually using it. It definitely has its purpose, as I previously mentioned in this video. But of course, if you are actually using some of these cameras, you're going to notice the same kind of things. And that limited dynamic range, those clipped highlights, That's reminiscent of the DV aesthetic itself, but it just means for more modern jobs that you might have where you might need to utilize the camera, the results you're getting aren't as good as something like a more modern sensor with more modern image processing as well. So that wraps it up for this episode, and Q time for now as well. I made a video recently about how I'm moving away from this format, which you've just seen with this episode of Q time, and moving to a more naturally speaking, just off the cuff kind of format of shooting videos. I've got some more content coming up, including a comparison of me using Final Cut 10 when I've been used to using Premiere Pro and some of the differences I noted between the two. And that's coming up really soon. So make sure to stay subscribed for that video when it comes up, and more content as well. And of course, if you have any questions or comments, just leave them down below. I'll answer them the best I can. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll catch you next time.